As the world's only country without a newspaper, how do people in Nicaragua get their news? I don't actually know that that's true, but that's what I was told, and I'm certain that Nicaragua does not have a newspaper, but I really think a lot of other countries probably don't either. But either way, it's a real question. If you're living here in Nicaragua, how do you get your news? Let's get to that today. Now, in the modern world, really, we have to consider that no one anywhere in the world is getting their news from newspapers. If you are, you're getting old news, and the world has moved on. So newspapers no longer play any significant role in actual news. Not that they weren't beneficial in the past, not that it's wrong to use them, but you have to look at them as a bit of a different type of thing these days. So the lack of newspaper here or anywhere else is anything but a problem. News happens much faster than you can print newspapers, and it's important to be able to maintain retractions and update information that is potentially incorrect. Newspapers really just make mistakes permanent, and that's not something you ever want to have when it comes to news. So in reality, whether it's here or anywhere in the world, we should celebrate the death of print news. The idea is one that has had its run and its time has passed. So the world now lives on the internet when it comes to news more than anything else, really. So that part is easy, but we still have a challenge. How do you get news here in Nicaragua? And I wouldn't say that the challenge is actually how you get your news. It's just if you're coming from the outside or you're new to Nicaragua or you're wondering about Nicaragua, then what resources are available to us for news may not be readily apparent, and it's something you may want to know. Well, let's start with how do other people get their news? If you live in the United States, for example, or in England or in India, how are you getting your news? Well, generally you have a number of major online outlets that handle news from around the world. And everyone is familiar with these names and these vendors, places like The Guardian, the BBC, Al Jazeera, and El País. In reality, lots of countries don't maintain their own major news sources. It's relatively uncommon, actually. The United States definitely does, although theirs tend to be not very respected. They are known for being extremely slanted, one direction or another politically, and modifying news as is needed to fit their constituents. This is the nature of American news that goes back to the earliest days of Pulitzer and similar in the almost, it feels like colonial times, but the late 1700s, and much of American politics was founded in the world of yellow journalism. So the United States has never taken journalism seriously in the way that, for example, the BBC or Al Jazeera do. These types of outlets globally are far more respected than anything in the United States. So even Americans who have many newspaper or ex-newspaper services generally look abroad when they're looking for a more neutral or true news source. Now, of course, knowing any media outlet is true is very difficult, and even pure journalistic services like Reuters or the Associated Press are sometimes suspect, so we have to be careful and always look with a critical eye. However, there are more neutral services that are more likely to be honest and actually reporting news rather than being opinion services that are using news tidbits to support a pre-existing idea that they want to promote. So we tend to look broadly at places like The Guardian, BBC, and Al Jazeera for global news because they tend to be much more neutral. There are some services in the United States that a lot of people use and feel pretty good about, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, but on the global scale, these are often considered kind of lesser. But it doesn't matter. The point being the United States looks abroad, looks internally. Many countries look abroad for major news services. So if you're looking at Al Jazeera, for example, which would be most likely my pick for a general news service around the world, although I like the BBC quite a lot, they're going to have very deep coverage of areas of interest for you, whether that's North America, Europe, the global stage, world wars, or what we tend to look at here, Latin America. So if you're looking for regional news, and remember, Nicaragua is only the size of a medium-sized state. It's smaller than New York City alone, making it a fraction of the size of New York State. If you were to look at Nicaragua, you would normally look at the regional news. We want to know about everything from Mexico to Colombia as a tight, close region, and everything from the United States or Canada all the way to Argentina and Chile as a complete regional thing. And of course, we have our interest on the world stage as well. And so normally we're going to look at those types of services that are providing a global picture of what all the countries in the region are doing. We don't care so much about internal politics because honestly, it's a very small place. The amount of interesting news that's going on inside the country is relatively small. There aren't a lot of things to be reporting on. So while you do want some amount of local news, the bulk of the news would be very similar to if you lived in, say, a Iowa and you wanted to know about what's going on in the United States. Well, we're just Iowa, right? That's about our physical size and our population size. We would want news from a much larger region, even if that news includes weather. The weather is so significant in the region that we would need to know what's going on with the Caribbean islands, what's going on up in Honduras, down in Costa Rica, as well as what's going on here specifically. So we'll be looking for a more regional service, even in a climatic sense. When we want local news of exactly what's happening here in Nicaragua specifically, rather than what's going on in the world around us, we have some sources. But it's true, we have fewer and lighter news internally than many of the countries around us or many of the places you may be coming from. We don't see a lot of reporters on the street. We don't have big news services that are driving around and filming things, but that doesn't mean we don't have access to an awful lot of internal news. First of all, Nicaragua is a very different culture, and so a lot of news travels by word of mouth. However, it cannot be overstated just how dangerous gossip is in the country and how much information you are likely to receive at different times that is nothing but hearsay. And so most of the things we hear turns out to just be something someone made up, or someone was, playing the telephone game, and over time the story got altered. So be very careful listening to word of mouth, but it is an important source of learning where you need to dig deeper. So if someone tells you some dramatic thing happened, just take it with a grain of salt, but don't assume that there isn't something behind it. So maybe that's something you're going to look into. So we take news fundamentally a little bit differently here. In the United States, you're used to an extremely formal process. Of course, one that allows for very heavy government oversight and propaganda. Not that that's happening on the local scale very often, but it certainly is able to, right? The government is able to basically step in and talk to what amounts to little different than monopoly interest in local printing presses, at least traditionally. This is going away a lot. And being able to put pressure on them. Oh, don't mention this thing, or put this slant on it, or just leave this little bit of extra information out. And there's very little alternative news because there are big official ones that control little markets. So you have to be very careful when you have that kind of control. Here in Nicaragua, we lean away from that. So while some people look at it as a lack of journalism, it's also a lack of government control of journalism. So we have to put in more effort to get our local news, but the local news that we get tends to be a little bit closer to the source and with less oversight. So here we have official news sources that provide a lot of information going on in the country that comes from the government directly, and they have a number of television stations, and you can get a lot of important news. And a lot of the news, I know a lot of people are going to say, well, I don't want the government giving me my news, but if you think about things like the BBC, Voice of America, there's a lot of national services that are somehow tied to the government that are very important for providing local news, even in markets where you may not want to listen to your government, right? You may not want any propaganda from the British government. I certainly wouldn't, but the BBC provides a very important news service, such as things like whether a bridge is out, if a uprising has broken out, if a boat has sunk, if something has happened, whatever needs to be let known for the public safety or the public good in the country. Those are very discrete things, and you're going to want to use that service because it's going to have the best access to emergency events and emergency information and official government information. Go here, don't go here, watch out for this road will be closed. Things that are very official, things that you may not have access to in other situations. So official government news outlets are an important part of your news ecosystem in any country at any time. It doesn't matter where you are or what you think of the government, there's something that you're going to need to use as a resource, and that's fantastic. But of course, you're always going to want, no matter what you think of your government or what country you're in, you're going to want to have some independent news sources as well. And often you need to hear multiple voices because you're going to hear people's opinions coming through in the news that they report pretty much regardless of what they try to do. It may not even be intentional, and it's just the way that news works. And this comes from, I have a news background. I was a photojournalist when I was young. I worked for Gannett newspapers in the United States, and when I was older, I ran IT for a petroleum industry news outlet that ran an online newspaper out of Washington, D.C. for a while. So I'm not trained as a journalist, but it is an area I've worked in for a lot of my career, and it's an important part of my background. So some of the things that are just really important to consider with your news news anywhere is that you need to have a variety of independent sources for your news in general. The government is great at supplying very official things like the bridge being out, but it's not great at getting the opinion of people on the street, even if they want to. So having ways to do that is important. In the United States, you generally do this through a variety of mainstream outlets, you know, your CNNs, your Fox News, and so forth. And you collect those if that's what you want, to hear voices on one side or the other, and you kind of find a middle ground that makes sense. Maybe combine that with your BBCs and your Al Jazeeras to try to find a useful point of view on your overall news. But the United States is a big market, so you're getting world perspective on many items happening inside the United States. You're not going to find that here in Nicaragua. You're going to find very little international news about what's going on here. For a lot of reasons, but like we said in another video, it's very expensive to send people to cover such a small market, and so often they don't. They rely on word of mouth on the street or some semi-official services kind of working from what they've heard in hearsay. So often we're struggling to get accurate information from large sources, from small ones as well, I suppose. So typically what people do here when moving beyond word of mouth, although that does prove to be a pretty powerful mechanism, is they turn to other accumulators of data that are able to provide some amount of channel for people who are looking to provide news. We don't have internally very many websites dedicated to being newspapers in the country. However, they do exist. So the statement at the very beginning that there are no newspapers in Nicaragua is only true insofar as we don't have any print newspapers available in Nicaragua. But that's a very antiquated system. We don't have any scribes copying down old scrolls either, but that's not a negative. That's just that we've moved on with the times. As some people say that print is still important, I would argue that that's a ridiculous thing to argue, but it's opinion, whatever. But importantly, if what you're looking for is local news, there are local news services that are providing some amount of news. I don't know of any that I find to be all that great, but there are some. But importantly, we have systems such as, and you may look around at the screen here, unless you're on a TV, and say, oh, this is YouTube, and this provides a number of different outlets for news in the country. So there are many YouTube channels that are providing news. There are agencies from other countries that have reporters here in the country. So I've met them on the street. Like, that actually happens. There are people here writing for newspapers in, say, Costa Rica or Honduras or whatever. So that can happen. We do get a little bit of coverage from places like Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. So if you're a member of the right groups, you know who to follow. There are independent journalists and independent news sources providing news throughout the country. And honestly, is that really that different than being in the United States or Western Europe? Yes, to some degree it is. There is big formal news from many different angles in those markets, but it can also be very difficult to filter them out. You never know who's paying them to produce that work. Here in Nicaragua, very often you're going to have very small news reporters for the obvious reason the entire market's only the size of a city. If you were dealing with a single city situation, for example, Dallas in the United States, which is about the same size as the country here, it's a little bit larger, we're actually smaller. If you were to deal with a Dallas and say, how would you get the local news in Dallas? And suddenly you'd say, well, okay, I get a lot of that news word of mouth. You do, actually, for your own local city. And you do go to Twitter, and you do go to Facebook, and you do go to Instagram of people you know, or of people that you know of people you know, right? You start getting into this, I know people who know those people, market really quickly, and you're getting voices from people that you have some connection to that are in different parts of the country. So when we get news from Esteli, when we get news from Managua, it's because we know someone in that spot who's relaying news to us, or we're going on to Instagram and looking at a page for that area or whatever. So it's a little bit more work for sure. I can't just name you a single source to go and get news. We spend more time aggregating news from smaller, more independent voices, but we do have access to news here, possibly even better than in some other places. My personal feeling, and this is very hard to say one way or another, but my personal feeling is that by having less government control, there isn't these huge number of very heavily government-controlled media outlets that kind of pretend to have a voice from different sides, kind of giving a controlled universal message. Here it's much more raw, and you're able to get closer to the source and get small sources that you may have more faith in, or are able to track down and view in a different way. And I feel like what we hear inside the country, while we get a ridiculous amount of hearsay and a ridiculous amount of gossip, but those things are generally easy to filter out if you care, if you're giving it a critical eye or ear, and you're saying, okay, so this gossip, this doesn't sound like real life. Can you follow that up with something? Is there any source for this? Well, my neighbor said. Okay, what was your neighbor's source? Well, they didn't give me one. Okay, well, maybe we should start there with, that's not very credible, and that doesn't make a lot of sense. Could it have happened? Sure, always possible, but let's try to figure it out. And we have the same problem here, that getting news out about official events can be hard. Oh, there's going to be a food tasting in Central Park next week. Who knows? Where do you find that out? It's not always super easy to find. And those sources can be a little bit difficult. So yes, there's challenges, but yes, we also do have local news. People who are interested in it, who want to find it, are certainly able to do so. And it may not be as handy, and maybe it's not as good, but honestly, it works decently well. And in such a small market, I think you'll find that once you're here, when you first arrive and you have no idea what's going on, yeah, you're going to be in the dark. And of course, all the news is in Spanish. So if you don't speak Spanish, you're really going to be in the dark. But once you've been here a little bit, you start seeing how people get their news. You start encountering how to get your news. And it doesn't take too long before you build up a relatively decent mechanism for accumulating news if it's something you're looking for. And honestly, if most people I know in the United States, they are constantly being controlled by the news sources they choose, because they find one place that they gravitate to, and it's not to pick on Fox News on the right. It could also be This Is My Left, by the way, so that was very confusing, and or MSNBC on the left, which it does. That it's anything, any given outlet has its skew and its goals that it's trying to manipulate you into. And so I feel that the United States has a tendency towards actually being a little bit more challenging to get good news, because there is so much large-scale questionable news outlets who definitely are working from grains of truth. And when you see those places reporting about places like here, and we know, because we can see firsthand, that the things they're reporting are often untrue, it makes me say, well, what about all the things in the United States that I can't see that they're reporting? How many of those are true? Right? And it's no wonder that so many Americans are so easily convinced that major news events have never happened. Right? You can convince people that entire wars have never happened because their faith in what news outlets are available to them has been shaken so thoroughly that it feels like anything could be a lie. Not just the little things, not just individual people or places you've never been to, but big things that define society and cause changes in law are often questioned. And that kind of stuff is really significant. So ask the question in reverse. If you're going to any other country, where are you getting your news? And I think what we're identifying is there is a global challenge in getting reliable news. It's a really hard thing. So in general, I tend to look to Reuters and Associated Press back to articles that are going to look, a little bit more reliable than other things. At least they have some journalistic integrity, if anyone does. And for example, we had the article a while ago about the girl got bit by the cat and she was sure she had rabies, had to do all these things. And we looked up the news that it came from. It was some newspaper in Australia. Well, that gives it some credibility, right? No, absolutely not. And when we looked up their source, it was hearsay. There was no news outlet source for the story. Some person had just made it up. And that doesn't make it false, but all the facts that were wrong in the case, all the results that made no sense, the clear purpose of the article to try to create a feeling of distrust, all based around things that had no foundation and in real life made no sense. If you were talking to that person, you'd say, well, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? Why did you spend all that money when this is free? And they would say, oh, I didn't think of those things or whatever. Then why is it a news article, right? It didn't have any facts to work from, but it creates FUD. It creates fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And tons and tons of news articles from around the world work that way. So learning to filter that stuff out is just a part of getting news from anywhere. And just because you have big news outlets that are supposed to have journalistic journalistic integrity, there aren't people following up on that stuff. And when they are, those voices are buried. Those voices are on Twitter. Those voices are on Facebook. Those voices are on Instagram. They're on Mastodon, right? That's where people are having voices. And so finding those voices is a challenge anywhere. So I really don't think it's at least dramatically worse here than anywhere else. It's just less in your face. But in a community so small, one could argue that everything is really in your face in Nicaragua. Nothing happens anywhere in the country without all of us hearing about it absolutely immediately, good or bad. Crazy weather events or seismic activity or parades or whatever. Absolutely everything is plastered everywhere. And this is a community where everybody has a phone, everyone is recording, everyone is a journalist all the time. And every little thing that happens gets put on YouTube and on TikTok and on all these services, and instantly everyone is sharing it because it's such a small community. It's like a high school. It's like a really giant high school. Everyone is sharing stuff to each other right away, and the algorithm knows that we're sharing it, and it instantly spreads everywhere. And so when something happens, we truly do find out about it through all those social media mechanisms that they talk about in other places as having failed because of all these reasons. Here, for the most part, they actually work. And when you are working to get the voice out, your voice actually does get out. And a great example of that is this show. It may seem like, is this really a big thing? This is really a big thing. When we put information on here, it really does get around the country. It really does get to a lot of people. People see it. It gets shared, it works. So when other people are doing that with news, because I'm not really covering news, I'm just covering how things are in general and information about, you know, travel and relocation and such. But if we were reporting news on here, you can imagine how quickly that would be able to spread if people, especially if we did it in Spanish and it was stuff that people cared about, people would have it shared everywhere really quickly and it would rise to the top and be even people with whom it was not being shared, they would get it pushed by the algorithm. So that is really how news gets around here in Nicaragua. Thanks for joining me. Like and subscribe if you'd like to help support the work that we do here. You can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/Scott Allen Miller. That comes directly to me and makes everything we do possible. It's kind of like supporting The Guardian, except we're not news. We're just a guy talking, but you know, it still takes a lot of my time. As always, share on social media, tell your friends about the show, and I will see all of you tomorrow. And now we're going to pop up some videos on the screen, pick one at random, and watch another episode. That does so much to help me out. I really appreciate it. Thanks for joining me. Have a good one, everybody.